Hello YouTube, this is Corey Newman. This is going to be part 2 of Operation Signpost, July 1952 air defense exercise. I'm going to talk about the some of the problems encountered with procedures and how the Eastern Air Defense Force dealt with these problems in their after action reports, what they encountered, going over all the details of the exercise within the Eastern Air Defense Force. So with this air defense, there were a lot of problems actually with this exercise that were encountered. This exercise was not really considered realistic from an operational standpoint and an actual possible enemy attack. It was not to be used as a measuring strike, measuring yardstick to measure the combat effectiveness or combat capability of the Eastern Air Defense Command, its fighters, its radars, its anti-aircraft, or its augmentation force, or any other part of the air defense network. So that was like the first thing that was put into their after action report on this exercise. So they're like, this isn't realistic, doesn't reflect combat effectiveness or possible combat capabilities. One aspect too was the civilian ground observer corps was not used because the bombers of the Strategic Air Command flew higher than under the 5,000 foot detection range of the civilians ground observers, so they weren't really even tested or even used. They weren't in their areas, so it may have been in the areas, but they were too high up altitude-wise to even really be effectively used. So the civilian ground observer spotters weren't really tested at all during this exercise. There were several radar blind spots along the St. Lawrence River and Lake Champlain in New York and the Hudson River Valley that the Strategic Air Command used to effectiveness to evade radar ability to be seen, because they knew they were being tracked once they came down from Canada during this exercise. So they used the Finger Lakes region, the St. Lawrence River region, and the Hudson River Valley, the mountains of the Appalachians, to essentially hide, to block their radars, in that area, New York and that. So that was one aspect that SAC used effectively, and the Air Defense Command and Eastern Air Defense Force wanted to put in gap filler radars, but they wouldn't be placed until after 1956 anyway. So there were radar track fades in this area and elsewhere on this. So radar would be tracking a bomber, and then it would just fade off the radar screen. And so it's like, yeah, you could use dead reckoning, but it wasn't exactly reliable. So that was a problem with continuous tracking of the bombers and the fighters also. So radar fades from the screen, radar returns fades The augmentation forces were pre-positioned 12 hours before the attack happened. So if they wanted to use augmentation forces during an air battle, they really couldn't use them effectively because they would still be in the deployment phase, because the Air Defense Command and Eastern Air Defense Force estimated that it would they would only have about a 30-minute warning from the radars along the east coast and along the northern Canadian border. So that was not realistic. The Strategic Air Command used voice jamming for between the radar sites and the fighter aircraft. So therefore, the fighter aircraft were flying blind essentially to attack the bombers. So that was an effective tactic by Strategic Air Command of silencing the radar sites and having fighters not be properly directed. So they were essentially flying blind. Like say, hey, they're at 30,000 feet altitude at 90 degrees, so the fighter pilots being launched and their communications get jammed between the radar site directing them. That was an effective tactic, and it hurt the Air Defense Command in that aspect. The civilian aircraft were not grounded during this exercise. This was they had plans in place to ground them, but it would hurt the economy, and the CAA would not, the civilian airliners would not go for it for this. So this hurt the Air Defense Command in that fighter aircraft were scrambled against civilian aircraft that were declared unknown coming from overseas or Canada during the exercise. So our fighter forces and that were not used properly or improperly used, and this was not a good thing. So fighter aircraft were scrambled against civilian planes that were identified as unknown. Just within the Eastern Air Defense Force, this was 134 fighters were scrambled against estimated 115 civilian aircraft during the exercise. So radar operators were also underreporting bomber strength, and fighter aircraft were also underreporting or misreporting. So the problem with this is that if you have, say, a formation of 5 aircraft on your radar screen and they're all bunched up together, you're thinking it's one aircraft, the fighter, the bomber, one aircraft of a single bomber, but it's actually 5. And so that's being underreported when the bombers are all bunched together. So the radar signal shows up as one blip when it should actually be 5 blips. So they all blended together into one big blip. So that kind of had a problem there. And fighters were only, if the SAC aircraft were using bomber streams, they would only see, like, say, one bomber in a bomber stream, and then, they would underreport it as one bomber when there were, 10 bombers, lined up, like half an hour after one another. So boom, 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 hitting the target, one right after the other. So that was also underreporting bomber strength, even on visual identification from the fighters themselves. There were procedural problems with the anti-aircraft artillery command and the radar sites. Communication problems, procedural problems. In other words, according to the rules of engagement then in place, the anti-aircraft artillery had to have a aircraft positively identified as hostile before they could engage. One, and they couldn't get that ability to fire from the radar site because of track fades and communication problems. So you had a lot of voice traffic back and forth between the radar site and the anti-aircraft artillery operations center. So a lot of miscellaneous traffic there. So you couldn't get a proper thing because, especially in the areas of Boston and New York and Philadelphia, in that corridor, you had a lot of civilian aircraft. So you would get tracks where civilian and bomber aircraft and fighter aircraft all were bunched up and seemed to be like one individual blip in this. So that caused a lot of confusion. So a radar site commander would not give the authority to battery commanders to actually fire their anti-aircraft guns, the 90 millimeters and 120 millimeter guns, because of this problem because of the heavy air traffic in this corridor here. And also in the Washington area, between the 35th Air Division and the radar sites around Washington, D.C., they didn't employ any communication lines between the radar sites and the anti-aircraft artillery communication problems. So the 35th Air Division anti-aircraft artillery brigade, then in place for defending Washington, D.C., had no communications with the radar sites, so they couldn't tell what planes were what. And they really didn't have any radars. And they weren't scheduled to get any radars for their sites until after 1952, as I understand the history. So that was a problem. So there's procedural problems, communication problems, rules of engagement problems, where the Air Force had authority to say, nope, you don't get to fire. We got fighters, pouncing on bombers, so they couldn't, and also bombers were flying, especially the B-36s, flying higher than the 90 millimeter, 120 millimeter fighter aircraft, or 120 millimeter bullets could actually travel altitude wise. So they couldn't even, they were overflying the guns, and the guns were completely ineffective. So, B-36s could easily fly above 40 or 50,000 feet, easy. Most likely probably did during the exercise. So that was a problem with the anti-aircraft artillery at the time. And also their deployment times, too, were also late, too. So it would take them several hours to deploy a battery of 90 millimeter or 120 millimeter from storage sites when you only have a possible 30-minute window of opportunity from the edge of the radar screen to a possible target. So that was a problem here. And we're talking vacuum tube technology, uh, voice telephone communications. And so if you have, say, 2 or 3 radar sites trying to call the operations center at the direction center at Roslyn, say, Montauk, Navesink Military Reservation, and Palermo, all trying to contact Roslyn all at the same time, and they're all trying to call the same phone. One of them's going to get through, and the other 2 are not. So you're going to have communication problems. And the same thing with teletype also, where messages would be, say, marked urgent during the exercise, would not be given priority, or would just come in over the teletype late to be effective. So you're having communication problems there, where you have radar sites, fighter sites, and that all trying to reach either one teletype machine or excuse me, or one phone. So these are some of the problems that were encountered during Operation Signpost. So I tried to actually read this, but it was just too long to read, so I just kind of gave a synopsis of the exercise from the Eastern Air Defense Force unit history narrative here, because the narrative, just reading the after action report would take about 45 minutes, and it's just too long of a video for that, so I just gave a quick synopsis here of this exercise and some of the problems with it. So I hope you liked it. Hope you learned something. And if you like this video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe and share the video. Thank you. Bye.